Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar, brought to you by TechStrong and Tricentis. My name is Cody J. Brown. I'm the host of TechStrong Learning. We have an exciting discussion ahead, but before we begin, I have just a few housekeeping notes. First, today's session is being recorded, so if you miss any of today's session or you'd like to share it with a friend, the on-demand recording will be made available shortly after the webinar concludes today. If you have any questions for our speakers today, I want you to direct those to the Q&A tab, which can be found on the right side of your screen. Or if you just want to add to our conversation or let us know from where you're tuning in, put those comments in the chat tab. Finally, at the conclusion of our webinar today, we will have a drawing for 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. So stick around to see if you're one of our 4 winners. So on to our topic at hand. We'll be discussing the top 3 DevOps lessons we learned in 2021. And I'm joined today by Clinton Sprov, Enterprise Strategist at Tricentis, and Mitch Ashley, Principal at TechStrong Research. And at this point in time, it's my pleasure to turn the floor over to them to get our conversation started. Thank you both for being here with us today.
Awesome. Thank you, Cody. Don't go too far. We're going to need your help with some things happening today. So Cody's part of our webinar today, not just kicking us off. Clinton, great to see you. Great to be doing. We've been on a few panels together, and I know some of these topics are near and dear to your heart. So I'm excited to kind of get into it.
Yeah, definitely, Mitch. Glad to be with you again, and really excited to jump into some of these topics.
Very cool. Yeah. So we're talking about top 3 DevOps lessons we learned from 2021, testing from GitOps, talking about DevOps Security, DevSecOps, and of course, measuring success. How do we know? Sort of an age-old challenge. I think we've learned a lot of lessons from. To our audience, I'm Mitch Ashley. As Cody mentioned, I am principal with TechStrong Research and also CTO of TechStrong Group, who is in part bringing this webinar to you. Clinton, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Clint Sprov. I am with Tricentis, and I serve as our Director of Product Marketing, also part-time evangelist as well for our testing solutions, and definitely a strong DevOps advocate. So really glad to be here and loving the fact that we get to recap some of the key topics from 2021.
Awesome. Well, I used your formal name, so now that we've gotten that over with, I can just call you Clint, so we're good.
There you go.
Good to go. Well, let's do this. So we're going to do something a little different in this webinar. We've participated on a video series called DevOps Unbound, which I'll tell you a little bit about, folks about a little bit later. But what we've done, our crack producer team has gone through and picked out and selected some interesting clips on these topics. And rather than having the same conversation again, there's actually some really good panelists that are discussing these things. So we're going to roll some tape, to use that expression, and share some of those videos. Some are short, a couple minutes. Some are, a little bit longer, 5, 6, 7, 10 minutes in one case, I think. So they're not too long, but hang in there. And Clint and I will be here. And then we'll add some additional views on top of that. I have to warn you ahead of time, I'm in all 3 of these videos, so you unfortunately have to watch me in the video and watch me in the webinar twice. So I'm not sure what anybody did to deserve that, but hey, we'll go with it, right? Okay, so this first topic that we're going to be looking at and going through is talking about testing from a GitOps perspective. And GitOps is one of the popular topics. It's sort of like the weather. Everybody talks about it, but not everybody does a lot about it. Well, meaning we're kind of early in this adoption cycle, but there's a lot of interest in it because there can be some really nice benefits to looking at how you do GitOps. But I think we're still kind of learning how to do it and how to adopt it too. So anything you want to add in, Clint, before we roll tape on this first video?
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting topic, and we're seeing that this is where a lot of organizations are kind of pushing their teams to go into GitOps. So yeah, this was a very lively discussion and a lot of great information. So yeah, let's go ahead and kick it off. I'd love to hear more from what they've said.
All righty. Well, I'm in touch with our control room. Cody, if you would start that first roll tape. Thank you.
When is GitOps a good thing to use? When is it maybe not a good thing to use? right? How tightly or how much does it change sort of the classic CI/CD pipeline that we've started to finally wrap our heads around, in DevOps, stuff like that. So I am going to, Brendan, of course, GitOps, GitLab, they both have Git in it. So we're going to make you, if it's okay, I'd like you to start off. Let's start with some definitions. What's GitOps mean to you?
That's a great question. And I think one that's still probably unsettled, right? Much like, defining DevOps can sometimes be seen as unsettled. GitOps came out of the cloud native community. And so a lot of folks maybe restrict the concept of GitOps to say it only, exists in a Kubernetes world, because that's kind of where this approach came from. But, we've seen folks employ GitOps principles to all kinds of different infrastructure automation, from old school VMs to containers to Kubernetes clusters as well. So when I think of GitOps, I think it kind of requires three things. One, infrastructure as code, right? You said that in the beginning. That's kind of like table stakes to getting in. It's something we've been working on for a long time, but really defining as code, right, in Git, the Git part of GitOps, what our infrastructure is going to look like. And then keeping that configuration stored in that code. And maybe the desired state is stored as code or not, but at least the way we get to that desired state is. Second, I think it's merge requests. So we call merge requests, you'll hear other folks call them pull requests, but the concept of using the point where someone is proposing a change as the central place where teams collaborate on, is this a change we want to do? Is this going to help solve the problem we're trying to solve for? Right? Bringing that concept to the world of infrastructure is hugely beneficial because it's how our developers have already been working for years and years. And making that merge request kind of that central source of truth for approvals and security checks and all those other things is really critical. And then last, I think it's the third thing is CI/CD, right? Of course. So, the idea of GitOps is automating that infrastructure update, with a very simple Git workflow. And so you really do have to have embraced and adopted continuous integration and continuous delivery, really, in order for, the whole package of GitOps to make sense for you all.
Pretty darn good. Comments, add-ons, thoughts? Parag, Tracy?
I would only add one thing here. If you say what is GitOps, I like to shorten it down. I think what Brendan just defined is all accurate, but it's operations by pull request. The goal of GitOps, what GitOps delivers is a hermetic, airtight, immutable deployment. And that is in essence what we're trying to accomplish by using Git as the place where we declare what we're and define what we're going to push out to or have pulled out to the cluster. So it's the concept of a hermetic deployment, something airtight that no human touched. Don't you dare touch that and then deploy it out because then we don't know what you did. So the whole idea is to create a hermetic process.
Love that. That was concise and right on.
I have a similar viewpoint. I think of GitOps as a combination of infrastructure as code plus event-driven architecture, right? In this case, we're talking about merge requests or pull requests or whatever terminology you want to use, depending on the flavor of Git you love. But the way I think of this as a former physicist, right, is entropy is there. It's too hard to keep track of everything. Humans can't remember everything. We need to be able to describe, as application developers have been doing for the past couple of decades in code, the versions of things, the documentation associated with everything, and then the automation that we've had in CI/CD, which people think of, oh, okay, that's developers pushing their code out. Well, there's no reason why we have to stop at application level. It needs to be the whole thing because application and infrastructure must stay in sync at all times. So by putting a description of both the application, the infrastructure, and within the surrounding environment, all three of those into Git, you're bringing the best practices of app dev into the whole world together. So they're all synchronized.
here's another thing, and Parag, I'm going to ask you to kick off as I take us a direction here, and that is GitOps, yes, it's for deployment. What about testing? Hey, Tricentis is all about testing. We're doing our testing in Git. That's GitOps? Right? Is that better, worse? Is that the way it should be? Always? Sometimes? Never?
So I don't know if I'd call it testing in Git, but I would say, now Git becomes a source of truth. So I think what Tracy said is right, that it's just that same sort of automation of infrastructure, but now moved into making Git the centerpiece of where you define this. So the Git part is unchanged, but the testing is now event-driven, right? So because you've merged in code, you've committed code, or you're going to do a pull request, that can trigger testing. And we call this continuous testing. And I think the evolution of this can even go as far as our test definitions themselves should also be put into Git. Okay, that's the next evolution that we'll have. I don't believe it's really commonplace just yet, but when that happens, then we are trying to describe as much as possible into Git as a repository and use the principles of version control added with the event-driven concept. So when a developer does X, or when an operator is in environment Y and something needs to change, that whole Git workflow can invoke continuous testing to say, do I allow that to merge back in? If you want to be have an approval, you could do those kinds of things. So to me, incorporating continuous testing, and the day that we put test definitions into Git as well, we've gone quite a bit further of completing this vision and really making DevOps real, right? Because DevOps isn't just releasing really fast, deploying really fast. It's deploying fast with confidence and ease. That's what we need.
Thoughts on that, panel?
Sure, seems like a natural evolution to include the test environment in it. As you say, Parag is probably not commonplace yet today. A question for you about that. Do you think that there's incentive with the folks that are taking care of the testing, whether it be the QA team or developers writing tests, things like that? Do you think they have the right incentives to move it into Git, or will be something else that cause it to happen?
I think as long as people have the incentive of delivering value as quickly as possible with the best mean time to recover, the lowest defect leakage rate, as long as we do break down those silos, as you said. If the testing team is, okay, well, I don't understand what the developers do, just throw it over the wall, and then I do my test, that's not going to work. This is talking about dev testers, the full stack developers. And as long as everybody's motivation is right, that we're trying to deliver value faster and faster, but we will not have confidence. A VP will not say, let my applications go out. They're going to look at portfolios of apps and say, what amount of testing has been done? What amount of security checks have been done? That's another thing. The environment, okay, that's the biggest entropy of all. We have the least control over the environment. Okay, the same code, the same infrastructure in different environments behaves differently. Until we get that environment description also into Git, coupled with the testing model themselves that says, here's how we tested in that environment for that application, for this infrastructure pattern, then DevOps becomes real. Until then, this is all talk.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's critical, and it's something that GitOps, again, this concept of GitOps, I think is exciting to a lot of people that have been trying to make DevOps real for so long, because it enables that in a way, right? We see the kind of the light at the end of the tunnel, I would say, if that is all brought into Git and all made into, something that can deploy, independent of any human interaction. Well, now you have the ability to do continuous testing. You have the ability to stand up in an identical environment, right? The golden egg goose or golden egg of a, hey, we want an environment that's exactly like production to really test in and really hit with security tests and know that when we do deploy to production, we're going to have that confidence. And so if you're able to continue to iterate on the environment, the infrastructure, just like you're iterating on the code, it enables you to then say, okay, now we can not only have the code to review and maybe some static code analysis that happens and some testing that happens and then maybe some human testing that happens. Oh, now we've also got an entire environment spun up automatically that mirrors production where we can have a high level of confidence that it's going to work when it really ships.
Excellent. Oh, thanks for if you want to pull that video down. Some really good stuff that I think we started out with a good working definition of GitOps, and sometimes that's the the first place to start because all of our terms tend to get overloaded and overused in a lot of different settings. So obviously a big topic there. Tricentis is a sponsor of DevOps Unbound. While we talk about a lot of topics, certainly testing is one of them. From a test perspective, some comments were made about, GitOps and testing. What's your perspective, Clint, on it? Do you have to really kind of fundamentally rethink your testing, or is it really just more of hyper automation into a GitOps declarative environment?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up and also mentioned the next latest future buzzword, hyper automation as well. But I think it really comes down to, when you think about just continuous testing in general, and this was brought up in the video as well, is the ability to, as Tracy talked about, operations as pull requests. And we need to be able to make sure that we're doing that continuous testing, and GitOps is the best way to ensure that. So you have less bottlenecks. So I think it's less about the hyper automation portion. I think it's more about how can we have this, hermetic way of pushing out the tests. So if I think it's like testing by pull request as well, being able to push out those tests, have them automated, but looking at kind of a broader view of testing in DevOps, because we have to look at not only, a lot of times we think of testing, we think of either unit testing or we think of the UI testing, but there's the API testing, there's, microservices, there's performance, there's security, there's so many different aspects that when we start looking at this, being able to control that and having everything in that Git repository so it can be versioned and managed as you start pushing out that new code. Because the last thing that we want is we talk about releasing things quicker and faster. And then we get to the point of, okay, we release it faster, but is it of higher quality? And that's the area where a lot of organizations get stuck. So I think GitOps is really going to be the future, to where it probably won't even be a thing anymore, in my opinion. I think it'll be just part of DevOps, and that's just the way that we do it. So yeah, I'd love to get your thoughts in terms of, because I know you were part of the panel as well. So
well, what a contrast. I mean, I was sort of having a flashback of the Friday is check-in and integration day, right? You had one day a week where we integrated code, and obviously far from that. I think what's really compelling and interesting is sort of the why around GitOps. It's not just a unique, interesting thing to do. I think one of the drivers behind it, and there are many, is that our environment is changing, just like our code is changing, just like our testing has to change. So we're in this constant mode of change. It's kind of like nothing's ever solid. It's always in a liquid form. It's changed. And so part of that is, when you do it, you're picking a point in time, and whatever the configuration was, the parameters, declarative environment, all of those things might dictate it. But that also gives you an opportunity to say, hey, we know these changes that were checked in have implications on this section of code, or we have some AI machine learning that might tell us some insights about problems we've had with that particular from an ops perspective. In other words, what I'm saying is there's a lot of opportunity to say, now that we're doing this in the moment when we need it, under the conditions that you have under that moment, you can apply other data, smarts intelligence, human automation, all of the above to it, to hopefully not just throw more wood on the fire and, just create a bigger testing fire, test everything every time. We can't do that. But maybe smarter and more pinpointed, and then use that information for better learning, more machine learning down the way? I don't know. What do you think, Clint?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that, because it's, if you take it just beyond testing in general, you want that process to where it's going to be not only just continuous, but you want to be able to, you mentioned hyper automation, you want to be able to automate as much as possible. And I think that's what, from what I've seen, and hopefully AI and machine learning is going to contribute significantly to GitOps and just DevOps in general. Because what we're seeing is that many organizations that they know they know they have to automate more. They know they need to do these things, but what happens is, and I've read several studies, and like the State of DevOps report, is that a lot of organizations they're stuck in the middle, meaning that they're doing all these things and they've kind of hit this plateau, and they just are locked into, how do I get over this automation hump? How do I automate more? And so there are so many different factors that go into it. It goes into skill set. It goes into the number of applications. Maybe they're trying to maintain legacy applications as well. So yeah, I totally agree with you that in terms of just making this something better and more automated, AI machine learning is going to have to play a huge part of that. And it's going to be I think it's going to be a huge learning curve for a lot of organizations, but I think this is kind of the first step to kind of get them going in that direction.
Kind of feels like the early days of DevOps in a way. You're in this, so okay, there's a little bit different way of thinking how we do this, and what does it mean? What do we change about assumptions we might make, or how we might do it?
Yeah, and that's exciting, because what we're seeing is just this iterative improvement of how DevOps is going to get better, and eventually it's going to get so much easier as we start implementing these new methodologies and techniques.
Mm-hmm. And appreciate Steve and Vlad, who jumped in on my sort of in the moments poll here of where are you in adopting GitOps. At least Vlad and Steve were early in this process, trying to figure it out, just getting started. A lot of folks are there, I would guess, or considering it, kind of watching it, right?
Yeah, and I think Vlad and Steve are right there with with many of their peers, right? Most of them are trying to figure out, okay, where do we go? How do we get this thing kicked off? And what's really the best approach, for our organization, our team.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And, how is it going to help us? How do we do it in a way that's going to bring us benefits? So
exactly.
All right. Well, let's do this. Let's pivot, to use another word of the day, kind of popular these days, to our next clip, another DevOps Unbound segment. And we're going to be talking about DevSecOps and AppSec. And how is DevSecOps changing our approach to application security? We hear a lot of terms, shift left. We hear, we need greater application security. Security gets built in up front into the process. We also have, porous architectures, more porous, that like frequent use of APIs and microservices and all kinds of things that bring up the topic of security. It's not for the security team. We have to think about it as an app organization. As you're thinking about app security changed much of late, or is it just sort of, no, I've always kind of been there? This is really just elevating the visibility of it.
No, I think it's evolved over the years. I've worked with several customers that have different aspects on security and how they implement with DevOps, because they're really just trying to figure out, one, DevOps in general, and security brings in a whole new wrinkle. We look at it from a code perspective, whether you're doing static application testing or dynamic application testing, fuzzy testing, the whole nine. So it's really evolved in terms of who's doing it, how often the developers should be doing it. So I'm hopeful and seeing a lot of great things in terms of how it's actually being implemented into DevOps, to where it really becomes an automatic. So when we say DevOps, security is really implied, so that it's easier for organizations to really implement it. So it's really become a standard in terms of DevOps. So DevSecOps is really that linchpin to make sure not only you're releasing faster, but you're releasing secure applications.
Excellent. Well, let's go to this next tape. If you don't know Alan Schimmel, he's not only co-host of DevOps Unbound with me, of course, he is editor-in-chief and CEO of MediaOps. Now we call ourselves Techstrong Group. So, well, Cody, if you would roll tape on clip 2.
So let me start things off, and then we'll be off and running. Andrew, as the executive director at OWASP, right? There was a time where clearly the OWASP member, the user, the person who you were existing for, was the security professional who was in charge of, as you called it, mobile app security. And then, of course, AppSec has become all the rage probably for the last at least 12 years, right? AppSec is, a lot of people say if it's not AppSec, it don't mean a thing when it comes to security. How has the rise of DevOps, DevSecOps as some call it, some not, how has that kind of changed who you serve, or who does, not you personally, obviously, but OWASP, who do you guys cater to?
So that's actually really interesting. I had a conversation with Mark Curfew, the founder of OWASP, a little while ago, sure, as I was appointed. And the original thing the OWASP folks worked on was the developer guide, which it's a developer guide for developers. And the reality is that we stopped talking to developers. We became very, very internally focused. And we've converted the vast majority of the InfoSec folks to the fact that apps are the firewall. I've done almost all my pen tests through firewalls and over SSL. So the reality is that the application has always been the firewall. We should have been talking to developers much earlier than this. My personal opinion is that, the thing that OWASP has to do right now is to refocus on talking to developers and having tools and information they can actually use in their tool chain. If we're constantly just having that internal, echo chamber conversation, we will fail. And it's really important to me that we actually start doing more stuff like the OWASP dependency check, which can be pipelined, GitHub actions and things like that. These are where we need to start focusing, not on PDFs. As the person who does the OWASP top 10 and the developer guide and the ASVS, PDFs are probably what we're famous for, but the reality is developers don't know of it, they don't use it. I really want us to get involved in Stack Exchange. The number of people who post to Stack Exchange just to copy and paste stuff, and that information is just wrong. It'd be really great for people like the volunteers and the chapters and the communities to get involved in things like Stack Exchange and other places where developers hang out.
Excellent. I didn't realize that the original focus was developers. Carolyn, you're in a funny place because you're chief strategy officer at a security tools company, and of course, as you mentioned, you LinkedIn teacher, or whatever the exact term is around AppSec and OWASP. How does that what Andrew said? How does that jive with where you guys see the world?
Yeah. So when I started my InfoSec career at eBay and Zynga, in both cases, these were companies that were running online operations 24/7 with millions of simultaneous users daily. And so it was always clear to us that we had to get it right when it came to talking with the developer. A couple of years before I began my career in InfoSec in 2003, the first version of the OWASP Top 10 was released. And right now, I want to say we're on version 6 or so. Andrew has been spearheading this project for a long time, and we're actually looking out the next revision coming out in February 2021. If I look at the most recent version, which is 2017 RC2, and I compare that to the original OWASP Top 10 that came out in 2003, one of the things that's very striking to me is that at least half of the stuff is the same. So that says to me that on some level, some of these basic security fundamentals that I think AppSec practitioners understand are not either being implemented by developers, and where's that disconnect? So I actually think that as an industry, AppSec tends to focus on sort of the hot and sexy things, which is like finding cool stuff and really interesting sort of sophisticated breaks. But I think that if you were to look at, for example, the past year or so, if you look at the 10 largest data breaches, I'd be willing to bet you that the majority of those occurred because of something that had to do with like a security 101 basic kind of thing gone wrong. And that tells me that we've been really focused on technology. And actually, the hard part is getting the people and the process to work out together. So that's something that I think a lot about. And I think it really speaks to the core of what we're addressing today, which is whose job is it? A security person can find all the vulnerabilities that he or she wants until that security person is effective at communicating what the security vulnerability is to a developer who can actually fix it, and convincing that individual that it's a priority enough to actually spend time remediating, then the code will never be more secure. So it's always needed to be a partnership. And I think that, these days, because of things like the transition of software development methodologies from waterfall to agile to DevOps, I think that culturally we're beginning to see some changes.
I just want to highlight one of those choices that you said. Realistically, the thing that I see as the OWASP Top 10 leader is it's self-referential. The things that people pay attention to is the things in the OWASP Top 10. And in fact, CWE is the MITRE group are about to release the CWE Top 25 in a few weeks' time. And it'll look like the last one in 2011. And this is really sad because people are actually concentrating on these. What we really need is for developers and security people to work hand in hand. And I would like to see the security folks stop delivering PDFs and start delivering pull requests. If you can fix the problem, you don't have to convince anyone. If you actually start talking in developers' terms and actually convince the product managers that this is the right thing to do, we're going to be a lot more successful than just saying, look, your baby is very ugly.
Andrew, bless your heart. Bless your heart. It's something I've advocated for. It's not that necessarily security people have to become the expert software developers, but I think we've sort of done this to ourselves by thinking security as a penetration activity, right? Something that we're testing from the outside. I mean, now we're talking about very porous software architectures and API security and Kubernetes container security. It's a much more different world than even 5 or 10 years ago. So what I've advocated for, and it's a little bit scary at times, but advocated for security people to learn software architecture, whether they learn how to code or not, but they need to understand what's going on inside the M&M as well as what the outer hard shell, if you will. And one way to do that is to bring software people into security groups. You don't have to go learn it all yourself. You can learn from other people and bring in skills as well. But to your point, it's not an after the fact thing. It's got to be right there in the flow, in the process. If it gets fixed as soon as you find it, because it's a priority, great. If it's a day, 2 week, month later, forget about it. It goes into the prioritization process, and it may be months or quarters before it gets fixed.
Grigori, we're all looking at you, man.
Yeah, I was ready to jump in just up to Carolyn, because what she said, it's amazing that now it's been so many, 2-3 decades that we talk about, design for security notions and trustworthy computing initiatives. And we still see what Carolyn said, the top 10 breaches. You still see something as basic as a SQL injection attack, right? Cross-site scripting, all that stuff that is almost, I view it as part of a developer hygiene, right? It's just something that you do fundamentally. It's like these days, it's not something that developers, we don't even have this conversation. Should developers write their own tests or not? Well, by the same token, there should be no conversation. Should developers think about threat modeling? Should developers think about, various mitigation strategies? Should they get, involved more with the security specialist when it comes to defining or going through the release gates? And yet, when you look around, those secure practices still hasn't made into the mainstream as much as I would have liked it to happen. So I don't know what you guys think. If there's some other ways to it just feels like people start looking at it only when the breach occurs, and then you're facing a massive litigation, right? It's like, but it's too late, right? We need to think about all of this ahead of time, and of course, everything that OWASP is doing and other organizations and kind of advocating for security, promoting the secure mindset, this whole movement of DevSecOps. I absolutely welcome it, because anything that we can do to make developers and everybody on the team to think about security early on, as opposed to the afterthought, is a good thing.
That I want to jump into. Well, first, let me ask, just has DevSecOps, has it changed how you think about the approach to application security and testing? And are we in a different world now, or you've kind of lived this dream already?
I wouldn't say I was living the dream, unfortunately, at least not now. But I think we've got to a point now where it's, security it's that standard. And I love, just listening to Grigori talk, because he's always very passionate about, these topics. And, he was absolutely right. It needs to get to a point to where it's basically just a part of how we develop software. Because we always talked about early on shifting left, making that cultural shift to testing, and security needs to be, we need to shift security left as well as, to the right, so that we can get this holistic view of how security is and testing is done from that perspective. So I definitely view this as something that we need to make sure that that level of communication, and I believe Caroline brought this up as well, is having the ability to make sure that, okay, if they find something, how do you communicate that to the developers? So I think with DevOps in general, and especially with DevSecOps, everyone's got to stretch that muscle, because now we're doing things that we didn't do before. A developer has to now think about security. How does he think about security? So it's kind of increasing their level of awareness in terms of how they develop software. So yeah, and I like your comment as well when you mentioned how you believe that security folks should learn a little bit about software development and infrastructure, not necessarily becoming experts, but at least having an understanding of what are some of the challenges on that side and vice versa. So yeah.
Well, good lesson. I always compliment your fellow co-hosts, so I appreciate that. It's interesting. And by the way, security folks, you'll learn very quickly, don't break the build. So that's, rule number one. But if you're going to go
exactly.
and fix some security issue in code, it's interesting, because we've sort of crossed over the Rubicon of you can't ignore it anymore. You have to look inside and what's happening in our apps if you're a security person, whether you know software really well or not. And by the way, a lot of security organizations are bringing software people onto their teams to do pen testing, or to do ops things, or to do sort of SRE version of what security people do. So you just can't, hey, here's your checklist, check it off for me to tell you're creating secure apps. Yeah, it's a contact sport. We have to be involved with each other. And I think a lot of that is just kind of learning how to do it. There's no rule book. There's no, run book for how to do DevSecOps. It's still, I think, an art we're learning.
Yeah, it's funny, when I was doing an enablement session for our sales team, we were talking about the definition of DevOps, and I kind of compared it to, chess versus speed chess, right? So it's like, that there's, you could be, a great chess player, but sometimes you put that clock on you and you have to, speed, then it kind of changes how you're able to concentrate and execute your strategy. And I think the same happens with DevOps in general, especially when you start adding security to the mix, because now the rules have slightly changed. Now I have to really think about security. Now I have to think about, operations. I need to think about how we test. I need to think about infrastructure, and infrastructure is cold. All these new things that back in the day I didn't really have to really account for, really even think about. So now I need to make sure that when we communicate this across the board, that we start to understand that it's about not only just the duration of how we're implementing this, the rules and the pace. So that's what's tripping up a lot of these organizations. So security is is one of those areas that I think we're definitely getting better. There are a lot of great security companies at the app level that are, being integrated into these DevOps processes. So I'm very hopeful, and I'm seeing a lot of great things happen just within the industry.
Yeah, I'm going to share with our audience a link I just put into chat. OWASP top 10. Several points made about it. Still very relevant, but also a lot of the stuff that was on OWASP top 10 when it was developed. Buffer overflows, cross-site scripting, SQL injection, authentication issues. They're still there. They're maybe in a little bit different order. If you look at this link, folks log on to that website, OWASP top 10. You can see between 2017 and 21, there's a lot of the same stuff. And I think that's one of the frustration points about application security. Now, not all of this is app security, right? Some of it's the infrastructure. Is, are we getting better? And it's not clear that we necessarily are, but on the other hand, we're creating so much more software, using so much more open source, so much more third parties, APIs talking to anything and everything, other SaaS services, our own apps. The complexity has gone way up. And so I think that's also part of what's sort of driving us together to at least have the conversations and decide how we're going to address security in our apps and improve it over time. Whether we change the OS top 10 into a whole different set of top 10 issues, maybe that's folly for thinking we'll ever get out of that. But it does seem like it's kind of Groundhog Day a little bit, looking at the OS top 10.
Yeah, it is. It is funny how just looking at that particular list of the top 10, which ones have kind of shifted in organizational priority in terms of, like, if you look at the broken access control, how it moved up from the 5th position. So what you're seeing is that, again, it's still got Groundhog's Day. It's just how have they reshuffled the priorities of what's important within that top 10.
Mm-hmm. When you think of just the increase in mobility apps from 17 to 21, 22, right? How much more,
Yes.
We do everything on our smartphones, everything we expect to be able to do it that way too.
Yes.
Well, good, interesting stuff. We have a third clip that I want to make sure we get to, because we could talk about DevSecOps for a long time. So we had an interesting DevOps Unbound segment that we tongue-in-cheek called "Lies, Damn Lies, and Metrics," right? Sort of a quote, using the damn lie or lies, damn lies, and statistics, kind of the same idea. Like, what's the most effective way to measure? What do you want to measure? What do you want to improve? And are you measuring the right things? Right? We can measure. We got more data than ever, so we can measure lots of stuff. But some of it's going to be a big distraction. Some of it's going to be a big help. So, before I get your comments on it, let's roll tape on segment 3, Cody, if you would tee that up, and let's listen here.
If we look at DevOps from the pipelines perspective, it starts to become clear maybe where we should be measuring things or why we should be measuring things. And one of the first things that a lot of organizations run into when they implement a DevOps strategy is they run into bottlenecks because they did not consider certain things. So perhaps the first place to start with measurement is to try to identify bottlenecks and then go from there. This way you're improving your process while you're getting some value out of the metrics, and you're also establishing what type of metrics you need.
I'm glad Frank brought that up, because I really think that for me, there are 2 classes of metrics that are the most important, underpin everything. And one thing I will say about the DevOps pipeline is, in my opinion, it doesn't start early enough. There's that fuzzy front end, and I think we need to expand it right back to where the idea happens. But my duality of metrics is basically, if we measure flow and we measure realization of value, we really have a concept of what the customer experience looks like. So we know how fast we're able to deliver the things that they need, and we're starting to understand whether we are actually delivering the things that they wanted.
And I just wanted to add, like Frank's point about bottlenecks is great, but we can get meta about it, right? We want to make sure we're very carefully selecting what we're measuring, and identifying bottlenecks might be a great start, but we need to carefully select which bottlenecks we even want to address in the first place. Just because we can see that something slows down somewhere or doesn't mean that that's necessarily an area of focus.
We could be waiting 6 weeks for a security check, and it's really hard to get out the way. But we could maybe, and Victoria may be having an example around, I don't know, test automation or something, Victoria.
Yeah, I mean, also test automation alone, right? You have tons of metrics you can actually measure just from a QA perspective. And if you don't measure the right things there as well, everything is at a standstill. But I think it's also very important to, I like the bottlenecks you just mentioned, Frank, because, you know, one is the team level, but then you also want to see how does it look from an end-to-end process? How does my overall customer journey look like? And I see quite often companies actually, they start and they identify the right metrics on the team level, they get the teams there, but then they are failing on the overall picture to bring everything together. A lot of people struggle with that. That's what I see.
I think the mistake that a lot of the teams make nowadays is that they either look at this and they try to relate either DevOps to like a waterfall ideology where there's a beginning and an end and you can measure certain points, or they look at DevOps as, this rigid structure on how you do things, where the whole idea behind DevOps is that, it's flexible and it could be easily modified to meet specific needs. So I think people run in not only into an issue of where do I establish metrics? Why am I doing metrics? But also, how you interpret those metrics. I mean, like we were talking about before, release frequency and things like that are great for, what we use as a term as vanity metrics. It's, hey, we accomplished something. But when it really comes down to it, what did we accomplish and how did that improve the process? And I think people are losing sight of that.
It's been said already, I think, here, but I think that focus on outcomes is really, really key. And I think there's a couple of other things I wanted to bring up. One is that we talk a lot about being data-driven in DevOps, and I'm starting to think actually about being more insights-driven. And the other conversation I've had recently is about doing less hypothesis-driven development and more impact-driven development, which I think is another really interesting iteration on our ways of working. And it reminded me when Alex was talking about this idea of having telemetry everywhere, which is wonderful. So the idea then is that you can get any metrics you want, and you don't want all of them, but at least you have the ability to choose them.
Interesting. I was just commenting in chat, the diverse perspective on metrics. Maybe that's why metrics is such a ripe topic for fodder of what are the right metrics. And I relate to several things that were said in there. One of the most important, I think, was Victoria's talking about, you can tunnel vision, my description on metrics and sort of get lost in the forest, but you have to pull back up. And Frank was saying, who's an analyst that I've worked with, enjoy hearing him again. You have to kind of ask yourself, now, why are we looking at metrics? What is it that's important to the business? That value stream thing, it's not value stream, it's the output, right? Is what we're trying to accomplish for the business. And whether it's improving, the customer experience or getting a new product out to market or responding to competition or whatever kind of business thing, hopefully what we're doing is tied to that. And how do we kind of get some metrics that can inform us if we're heading in the right direction for the folks that are signing the paychecks? You agree?
Yeah, totally agree. And I think Frank hit the nail right on the head when he said, vanity metrics. That is typically what we will want to put in front of the leadership. Hey, look how great we're doing, or look at this. We've had fewer defects, but are we creating a very, do the metrics meet the reality of what's being put out there? Because when we start looking at it, and when I, in my past life, when I sold some of the DevOps tools, one of the questions customers would ask is like, well, what about some of the actual quality metrics? What are we getting from, how is our testing? How is our, not only just, how many tests have passed, how many have failed, but are we really getting better? Like you said, are we looking at the right things? What's really important to us releasing great software? Do we want to focus on, we don't care about the vanity metrics sound good, but are we doing things that are really going to impact the application that we're putting in front of our user base and our customers?
There's a lot of attention when you talk about DevOps is, how many deliveries are you doing per minute, per hour, per whatever, small denominator. and I think you kind of have to first ask, are you delivering the right stuff on that increment? It doesn't mean you can, if you're delivering poor quality or the wrong updates, the wrong functionality on a more frequent basis, that's not going to get you anywhere. Just kind of get you in a deeper hole faster. Fortunately, hopefully we're not all living in that, dystopian world of testing and software, but it does cause you to ask, do we really care about meeting a certain number of deploys per hour? Do we care about delivering on capabilities that are important to our customers, partners, employees, business goals, things like that? Not something testers, not even developers, are talking about every day today.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to, if you look at, you talk about some of the metrics of, how many releases did we accomplish, or how many have we put out that year? I mean, it would be even a better metric if you pushed out fewer releases but had a higher threshold in terms of quality. And I think that's what it really comes down to, or are what we're looking at, are we measuring the right things, right? So you can't manage what you can't measure, right? So it comes down to, what are we doing to make sure that we're releasing high quality applications? So metrics plays a big important, and I think if you break it down into those key areas, the way I look at it is, if I'm a engineer, software developer, there are certain metrics that we need at the team level. There are going to be certain things we're going to need at the organization level, certain things we're going to need at the corporate level, and being able to kind of have that, not only that, that isolated view, but kind of the holistic view that shows that, hey, we're doing the right things. So yeah, this is another topic that could go on forever and ever and ever.
Well, I was thinking talking about quality, fewer and quality. We're in the perpetual land of we want it all. So we have to figure out that, right. The best blend of getting, I used to work construction long ago, and they had a saying, it's good enough for who it's for. I mean, it doesn't have to be perfect. It's like there's a threshold of that's what we're trying to meet. It may not be 5 nines uptime, right? Or whatever it is for the specific situation. There was another interesting topic that Alex Hidalgo was talking about, and he comes from the SRE world. If you don't know Alex, he's got a great book on SLOs out, by the way. Now, Frank mentioned this too, is the bottleneck issue, and that comes straight out of constraint-based management. If you can go read it in the Phoenix Project, you can step back and read the whole background behind constraint-based management. But that's the idea of working on any problem before a bottleneck basically doesn't help, because all you do is arrive at the bottleneck faster with more stuff. Or working on any problem past the bottleneck doesn't matter, because nothing ever gets to it any faster, because the bottleneck holds it up. And there's a lot of validity to that of, yes, you don't want to just chase every bottleneck, but that is where you're going to have things that are breaking down and impacting other parts of the process. And how do you look at bottlenecks from a testing perspective?
Yeah, it's funny because a lot of organizations typically view, especially when they're trying to go through this DevOps transformation or just DevOps implementation, they usually consider testing as a bottleneck. And I have to, kind of, back up and say, well, wait a minute, testing isn't necessarily the bottleneck itself. It's what are the processes around it that are actually causing that to be the bottleneck or the lack thereof. So when I look at bottlenecks, I think it has to be, because it's easy to kind of point the finger at one particular area without necessarily understanding what is the root cause of the problem. And I think that's what we've gotten away from, is digging into what is that actual root cause of that actual problem. So when it comes to bottlenecks, I try to look at it from the standpoint of, if you tie this back to metrics, when someone says, okay, we want to automate more, we want to go through this quote unquote hyper automation process. And I can say, look, we've automated 80% of our processes or of our testing. Well, yeah, that's that vanity metric that Frank talked about. But just because you've automated 80%, are you really getting the core benefits of automation? What are some of the downsides in terms of what you have automated? Did you automate it the correct way? And that's not just from a testing perspective, but you look at automation across the entire DevOps spectrum. So that's kind of my viewpoint in terms of just bottlenecks and what's considered a bottleneck within DevOps and DevSecOps in general.
I'm going to reference to, because you're talking about is testing a bottleneck, and I won't give away the answer, but I'm posting a report that TechStrong Research did, sponsored by Tricentis. We've worked with you on a few projects lately, and it's is testing the bottleneck that we have always thought of it as, to not to be too crass about it. There's a link in the chat about that, and I'll give a little bit of the answer away. I think what I took out of this research, so please check it out, is that testing, instead of being like documentation, it was the thing that happened at the very, very end, right before documentation, which never got done. And so testing never got done either, because everybody consumed up everything. I mean, it's real. It's what happens, right? But I think the realization is we live in a world where we are delivering under higher expectations, direct impact to the business. It's not just back office stuff. While that's important too. Testing has been elevated in its importance. And I'm not saying everybody lives, eats, and breathes and sleeps, testing, and that's all they talk about. But I think we live in a world where that's more respected. It's something that's more higher importance to the organization, and we have to be good at delivering on. True?
Oh yeah, definitely, and it's definitely has been elevated within organizations. If you look at just the number of not only just Tricentis, but the number of companies where they're really starting to put more emphasis on quality and automation and implementing a lot of AI and machine learning to ensure that testing is done as early as possible. Because again, this whole speed, release faster, get it out the door, that doesn't cut it today. You have to be able to compete. So if you're going to release a product and it's inferior because you haven't done the type of testing that needs to be done, or the amount of testing needs to be done, that's going to cause organizations a huge problem. So yeah, totally agree.
Excellent. I'm getting a message from the control room here. Cody's reminding me that he needs to do a little wrap up, announce our winners. Thank you, Cody, for the heads up. So before I hand it back to Cody, I just want to say thanks to you, Clint, for being an excellent collaborator in this and other conversations. And also thanks to our audience for your participation in chat and for being with us today. The fact that you've stayed with us for almost the better part of an hour. Hopefully we've used your time in a wise and helpful way. So Cody, thanks to you for teeing up those videos and making Clint and my jobs easy too. So we'll turn it back over to you, Cody, to wrap things up.
Sure thing. So a quick reminder to our audience that today's session was recorded. If you missed any of our discussion today, you'll find a recording of this living on the DevOps website. Just visit devops.com/webinars and look in the on-demand section. You should also receive an email with a link to the on-demand recording. So quickly, we do have 4 winners for our $25 Amazon gift card drawing. They are Kelly B, Pia K, Juan L, and Katie N. So congratulations to the 4 of you. Keep an eye on your inbox to claim that gift card. And if you don't find that email, just check your spam folder. Mitch, Clinton, thank you so much for being here with us today, for breaking down these videos and further analyzing what we learned back in 2021. I'd also like to thank Tricentis for sponsoring today's webinar. And my final thanks goes to you, our audience. We appreciate you being here with us for the entirety of today's program. Please take a moment to fill out our post-webinar survey, and we hope to see you at a future TechStrong Learning webinar. This is Cody J. Brown, signing off.